Amanda Fisher, it's fantastic to join us this afternoon. Thank you for contributing to the TED Talks.
Craig, thank you for inviting me. So yes, I'm Chief Executive of Amey, and Amey is a leading infrastructure services and engineering company. And whilst we're not an everyday name, every household in Britain actually benefits from what we do. And we are actually at the heart of the recovery, our economic recovery going forward, because our workers are actually there in the front line, or are classified as essential workers. So we've been working all the way through COVID this year.
So we have 20 minutes to get into some of those. Our subject, of course, is decision making and what influences us. So we just have 20 minutes to get into the heart of some of those decisions you've been making, Amanda. So perhaps if those are, I'm sure everybody knows Amey, but just if those who don't, perhaps just a bit of an idea of the scale of the operation that you're in charge of.
Yeah, so we have 16,000 people in the organisation. We're a multi-billion-pound organisation, and we cover, mostly essential services. We keep our highways and our rail moving. We do facilities management. We look after the whole of the defence estate and also all of the military housing. And we've got a big presence in utilities, as well as in waste treatment and waste collection.
Excellent, thank you, Amanda. So we've got an idea of the scale and scope of your operation. Thank you for that. So perhaps let's start, if I may, with a very general question. Our subject is decision making. It's a very big subject. I know we only have 20 minutes, but I'd be really interested if perhaps you could just reflect on it for us, either from an individual level as CEO or from an organisational point of view. What are the considerations that you have in the decision making process and in decisions? How you go about it, how you think about the decision making to make sure it's effective, of course.
Yes, it's quite interesting. Having taken over as chief executive, I was already in the organisation as a managing director, and probably the biggest change for me was when I became chief exec, everybody was looking to me to have the answers, and they just assumed that I would have the answers to all the issues. Even my peers who I've been working on the board with for the last 2 years. And so I think for me that was a big cultural shift as well. And I also realized that the decisions that I was going to be making, not just for the organization, but having going through this unprecedented time of COVID, was actually going to shape the organization for the future, because the decisions we were making today were actually going to be those of the future. And I didn't actually have a template from which to work from.
Because of COVID, sorry, Amanda. So you had no template because of COVID, or was just because?
Yeah, I think because of COVID, it was such. We were entering into an era where people had never, had to embrace that before. So in a way, it was a good opportunity for me to advance and bring forward some of my agenda, but also it was making the decisions as the problems were arising that were actually going to shape the outcome.
Yeah, and all of the risks that entails, of course, having that level of. May I just, you said something really interesting at the start of that, which is about the expectation of the organisation when you were appointed CEO that you would have all the answers. That's a really quite a curious and interesting. Did that surprised you by the sound of it? Did it that they would have that?
And then and I'd never given it any thought before, if I'm honest, because there's always somebody above you in an organisation that you can go to, and normally your decision isn't the ultimate decision. There is somebody else who can test it or can challenge it. But then sitting at the top of the organisation, the decisions I were making, people were actually listening to every word I was saying, and that they were enacting that. So of course that then made me much more conscious of the decision process. And it comes back to what you were saying in terms of, do you really think through the formal process? You probably don't, but I'm now much more aware of thinking of the consequences of my decisions, having to think much more into the future and the implications of those decisions that I'm making in the here and now.
So you got into a position now, it sounds like, and these are my words, I apologize, that where you're more confident about structure and processes of decision making that you are the centre of as CEO. Is that the right way of thinking about it, as opposed to when you started?
Yes, it is. And I mean, I have to say my days in the military really set me up and gave me the training and also the development to in terms of the decision-making process, inevitably going through Sandhurst, that you go through all of that, and that set me in good stead. I hadn't realized till I took up this position actually just how under the microscope you are. And if decision-making isn't just a standalone sort of process, it fits very much in with the culture, not just the culture that you've got in the organization at the time, but the culture that you're trying to create as well, because the decisions that I was making was actually influencing and changing that culture. But it was also the fact that the decisions that I was making, people were looking to me. Now, having 16,000 people, it's very difficult to make those decisions, that people, or rather, you try to make decisions for 16,000 people, you're not going to get everybody understanding necessarily those decisions or the reasons why you're making them. So communication then became very much at the forefront of that.
Two or three really quite interesting things you've said there. And one was about the cultural aspect of this, which perhaps we'll just come back to in a second, actually, the link between the culture and your cultural agenda for the organisation and the decisions that you're taking. You've clearly been on something of a journey between your appointment as CEO and now, actually, in terms of the decision-making process and so forth. Can you say perhaps how that's changed over that time from the point of view where you suddenly realised that you were right at the centre of the decision-making process, and people looking to you to make it, to where you are now? What it is that you're doing differently as CEO now versus when you were appointed? Is it possible just to say a bit more about that?
I mean, that's a quite it's a good question. And in terms of how I suppose decision-making was one of those things that you do naturally. As a leader, it's expected of you, but then becoming the leader of the whole of the business, you then have to be much more of a cultural lens that you're looking through. And the organisation, or rather the market that I'm in, the industry that I'm in, is very male oriented. And whilst we're trying to encourage diversity, it's male in terms of age as well. There's an age profile, there's also the demographics and the background. And we're talking that we're going from, PhD consultants right down to the people who are actually delivering the services out on the ground. And those decisions are affecting everybody in the organisation. So it meant that I had to be probably more collaborative, more communicative, and make sure that I was connected still to what was happening out in the organisations, that I kept real, but also that I made sure that my board were keeping real and honest. Because I think the higher you go in an organisation, the more disconnected you can become. And the decisions then tend to be made around the boardroom table, as opposed to the decisions being made for the benefit of the organisation.
I see. So part of what you had in mind, or you have in mind, is how you make sure that the decisions that you're having to make, that you understand the stakeholders for that decision, otherwise your employees, and so you feel like you're close to them, and that you can make the connection between the effect on your organisation and the decisions you're making, rather than just being in a boardroom in this sort of classic smoke-filled room.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that changed the way that I was actually sort of looking at the way I was making the decisions. So we've launched what we call change makers in the organisation, and we have a group of individuals all the way through the different business units that come together, and they help us with the big decisions that we're looking at, to see how they would land, to see whether the way we're communicating them is right, whether they have a different way of looking at the outcome that we're wanting to achieve. And they're helping us as well shape those decisions out on the ground, so that when we go out and we say, this is the change that we're making, then apart from the fact that we know it's going to land in a much better way because it's been tested, but it's also been shaped by those who are receiving that decision. And that's changed the culture for me massively. And actually this year we launched, or rather last year at the beginning of COVID, we launched our new strategy, which was as simple as freedom to perform. And what we did was realize that historically the organisation was making the decisions from the top down. And then what I did was reverse that and said the people who are best placed to make the decisions are at the front end of the business. They're the ones with the information at the time. They're the ones that can make the appropriate decisions, in the moment and for the client. So we launched Freedom to Perform, which gave the framework, but also responsibility and accountability for making those decisions that they believed were right. And then we underpinned those by guiding principles. I sort of moved away from values and said that values are personal to individuals, whereas guiding principles help you, understand how we are as an organisation. And we had those as empowerment, engagement, and to excel. And that's really changed the way that the organisation now sort of addresses actually decision making, I suppose, because they're feeling more empowered rather than to have to go up to the top. And then by launching the likes of change makers so that they can help us in terms of the board as well. We don't just keep to our the sort of the 10 members that are on the board. We bring in people to have those conversations. It depends what the subject is, but we bring in subject matter experts who will sit on the panel with us to help inform, what the outcome should be. And again, that's connected the organisation, and it's also helped those people in the organisation understand why we're going in the way that we're going or making the decisions that we're making.
Because they're involved in those right at the top.
They're involved, and also those out on the front line as well are seeing that there are others in the organisation, not just the board and the exec or directors making the decision, that the decisions have been influenced, that we are seeking more information and a reality to what's going on.
What's really interesting about the organisation structure for decision making and culture change you've just described, if you think about what you said right at the start about when you were appointed, you had to make all the decisions, or you felt you had to it's a real transformation, isn't it, that you brought about from that feeling that it's always me through to actually you now have an organisational culture where decisions are made at the right level with the right information by the right people. That's a really significant transformation.
It isn't, I wanted to be a more modern organisation, and I wanted to have a progressive culture as well. And I think, COVID, if I'm honest, has given us that opportunity, because it was an opportunity for me to bring forward, as I said, my agenda. And nobody could say this is the way that we do things here, this is the way that we should be doing it, because it was new territory. And I think actually, the toughest decision I made was through COVID, and it was to invest in our workers when every other organisation and all our competitors were looking at their balance sheet. They were trying to stop the cost, they were trying to minimise expenditure. For me, it was a case of I need my workers out there on the front line. They're the ones who are going to continue delivering the service. So I didn't cut pay. In fact, I gave a pay rise. We brought in the real living wage. I was always going to do that, but I accelerated it by a year. We enhanced our sick pay. We enhanced our annual leave. And it was an opportunity to start levelling up the agenda for all our workers and to really show them that we were investing and that they were important. And we talked going through COVID about well-being and stress. And for me, when I was reflecting, the biggest point of stress is how am I financially secure going through this? Have I got a job? Have I got money to pay the bills? So the first thing that we did was made sure that we addressed those financial concerns. And then, we put less than 5% of people on furlough. We allowed people obviously to work from home. And we've continued that investment. And in a way, it's gone against the grain for the rest of the industry. They haven't been doing that. And this was a decision that it was tough because I was out there on my own. But again, I was listening to the organisation and what they were asking for or what their concerns were and addressed those.
At the time. Amanda, that's absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure the culture change that you've just described in the organisation was a result of many, many decisions. It almost, and perhaps I misunderstood you, but it almost felt like there was sort of one decision that you took, that this is what I'm going to do, despite COVID. And it sounded like you had an agenda that you really wanted to drive through with anyway, but then COVID. Can you recall, was there a moment in which or a point at which you said, right, this is how I'm going to do this, and where you said you were on your own, I think.
Yes, it was. Actually, it was an interesting moment, and I will never forget it. It was actually the fact that we'd made the wrong decision, and it was from making the wrong decision that the right decision then came from it.
Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so what happened in the very early days in COVID, and this comes back to people expecting me to have all the answers, when we went into lockdown and it was the sick pay and are people going to get paid while they're off, I then said, well, we've got contractual sick pay, so we should just pay contractual sick pay, shouldn't we? That would make sense. And then it didn't matter about the differences across the business. So that's what we said. And then it was the unions that picked it up and said that we were, we weren't paying. We were thinking more about cost and the organisation than we were about individuals. And that how come somebody who goes on to furlough and could earn 80% of their salary or their wages would be earning more being at home than they were if they were, sick or not being able to work. And that resonated with me, but very quickly. And again, decision making, it depends on complexity and timing. That same day I came out and made a statement that we'd got it wrong. I explained my thinking, my rationale for the decision we'd made, but then changed that very quickly and said we will pay sick pay for anybody who has to take time off because of self-isolating or quarantining, whatever happened. We would honour that, because it shouldn't be the individual that was then, paying that cost. Right. And then that was the trigger then to say, right, we need to continue this momentum. I could lose 16,000 people, their confidence in me, literally by making that wrong decision. So that's why we decided that that's what we would do. Difficult, very difficult decision, but it paid off.
This presumably fairly early on in your tenure, was it?
It was within the first 3 months.
So very early in your tenure.
Very early on. So, this was either going to be, I was either staying or I was going.
And perhaps if I could, one of the fascinating questions about decision making, particularly at senior level, is always the kind of the sort of evidence-based decision versus the intuitive nature of a decision. And my feeling is that you had some intuition kicking in there. I mean, because you came out with a culture change at the end, and you almost felt you knew what you wanted to do. Would you just perhaps unpick that a little bit for us about whether, if you can think back to that time, how much of it was you were looking at evidence and making a decision, how much of it was just, actually, no, this is just the right thing or the wrong thing to do?
Yes, I've always worked on informed decision making, always. And, I do look at the data, I look at facts, and I seek advisors or information to help, get to the complex decisions. However, I think through experience, I also know myself very well. And, this is where your emotional intelligence kicks in. And if you get this sixth sense or this feeling, I've learnt over the time to go with that. When you get to a point with, it's a fine line, should I, shouldn't I, then I do listen to my sixth sense. And I think that, I found that, as I said, from my sort of military training, really helped me with that. Once I've thought through the situation and that decisive, I've learned that if something doesn't feel right or it doesn't appear right, then normally it isn't right. So, and obviously conversely as well. And so that's what that did kick in on that particular decision. Although all the facts said, look, we've got contractual pay, nobody can argue about that. In the situation, it just didn't seem right that people should be suffering financially.
Or didn't feel right.
Yes.
Didn't feel right. And you're very conscious of that, are you, Amanda? So when you're in the decision, you really do say, my intuition will indeed play a role for me personally in my decision-making process, and you explicitly give it space and room to do that.
I do, but I also, as I know myself, I'm also very aware that there can be biases, an unconscious bias. So it's making sure that I've gone through all of that, working through the sort of process, and then it's the ultimate sort of factor that I will listen to.
Okay, perfect. Amanda, I'm really sorry, we are up against our time, as we always are. I know it's such a fascinating conversation. So really, it just remains for me to Amanda Fisher, CEO Amey, to thank you so much on behalf of the TEDR Academy and the University of Lincoln International Business School for your time, for such a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
Craig, thank you. I appreciate the time.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.